I want to thank you for joining with me today again as we continue our series looking at the Gospel of John. Now, last time we had discussed the wedding at Cana in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John and talked about the sign that Jesus gave and the meaning behind what he did. That, of course, the miracle itself was impressive and incredible, and that he was able to take water and turn it to wine and to produce such a fine quality as well. But ultimately, the purpose of John recounting this and what he took away from it and wants us to understand is not just that Jesus was able to do something miraculous by transforming water to wine, but that what he was able to do was to take something from the old covenant, something, the ritual basins, the things that were used to wash hands and go through a cleansing from the old covenant, the time of Moses, to take something like that and to produce something fresh and invigorating from it, to take it and remake it and use it for his own purposes. And that's going to be a little bit of an analogy that we're going to see continuing through the Gospel of John as John points to the authority of Jesus and his ability to take what was in the Old Covenant, what was passed down from Moses, and to go beyond that and to bring us something even greater than what was presented in the Old Testament. And so now we're going to continue our series, and we're going to pick up in chapter 2 again, and our focus is going to be on verse 13, and we're going to complete the chapter together, which is to verse 25. So I invite you to find your way there with me to the second chapter of John. And we're going to look at Jesus cleansing the temple and a discussion about the situation that is unfolding here and what's happening. So join with me, if you would, in reading these verses. John writes, "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, 'Take these things away, do not make my Father's house a house of trade.' And his disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' And so the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' And Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' And the Jews then said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man." So there's a lot that's unfolding in this portion of the story, but I want us to just go back to the beginning here in verse 13. And we're going to talk about the Passover and the encounter Jesus has at Jerusalem. Now, one of the interesting things you may notice to start off is that John's positioning of this story is different from the positioning of the story in other Gospels. So you'll notice that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, that the trajectory of the events happens basically the same. The major events follow the same basic order. Some of the details, they may share different details or perspectives on what was happening, but ultimately the timeline is pretty much the same. And for them, they really focus on Jesus' ministry in Galilee primarily, and then it's sort of like a story where he begins in Galilee and it follows him and his ministry and eventually gets to Jerusalem, the Passion Week, and focuses on what he does in Jerusalem. And so there's really only one major discussion in the synoptics about him being in Jerusalem and what he does there. And so the cleansing of the temple is accounted at the end of their Gospels, talking about how he approaches Jerusalem for the Passion Week and aligning those stories in that way. Now with John, you're going to notice here that what happens in John is that he focuses more so on what Jesus does in Jerusalem rather than Galilee. So he's still going to tell us about things that happen in Galilee, of course, but he's going to spend more time than the other Gospels do in focusing on what Jesus does in Jerusalem. And for him, he doesn't recount for us just one story where Jesus goes up to Jerusalem and everything kind of happens in that week. For John, he's going to account or give us an account of many different things or situations in which Jesus was in Jerusalem. And of course that makes sense because Jesus would have been keeping the law perfectly, which included going up to Jerusalem for the different feasts and things like that, several of which were required by the Mosaic law. And so it makes sense. We understand that Jesus went to Jerusalem more than once, and there's no conflict in this. There's no issue that's arising here. The point is that the Synoptic Gospels just focus on the one trip to Jerusalem at the end of his ministry when he's crucified, because for them, that's how they're structuring the information. Right? For them, it's about showing him ministering in Galilee and making his way up towards Jerusalem for that pivotal week. It's not that they're presenting the idea that Jesus only went to Jerusalem once. They're just not concerned with sharing those prior trips because their focus is somewhere else. For John, his focus and the angle that he is coming from is focusing on what Jesus did in Jerusalem, how he confronted the Jewish leaders and people like that. And so he is more concerned with what Jesus did in his ministry in Jerusalem than the other gospel writers are. So he's going to address Jesus being in Jerusalem a number of different times, rather than just leaving out some of the things early on and focusing on the one and final trip there, which is what the other synoptic gospels do. So Jesus cleanses the temple here. Now, with this being at the beginning of his ministry, it seems, rather than the end, we could also understand that Jesus perhaps cleansed the temple multiple times, that this wasn't just a one-time situation, but that he went about this, a couple different times when he was there. That's certainly a possibility. But as you're looking at this story, you'll notice that it is the Passover, and so he is going up to Jerusalem as faithful Jews would have been doing. The Passover was, the penultimate, festival for the Jewish people. The Passover dated back to the Exodus. It was the story of the Exodus. That's where the Passover originated, and the reason why is because when the Jews were taken out of Egypt, when God delivered them by the hand of Moses, and he was leading them out across the Red Sea, that the night before they were to leave, in order to secure their ability to leave, to allow, for Pharaoh to get to the point where he would allow the Jews to walk away, you had the night where the angel of death, or the Lord, that he went through the town and through the land of Egypt. And in going through the land of Egypt, he passed over and struck down the firstborn of anyone who did not have the blood of a lamb that had been sacrificed covering the doorpost. And so this became known as the Passover, because it was those who had the blood of a sacrificed lamb on their door that were passed over, that judgment of God did not come upon their household. And so then that ultimately triggered the events by which the Jews were able to leave. They were able to get out of their imprisonment, out of their slavery, and to head towards the Promised Land. This became something, according to law, that they commemorated every single year, and that of course still happens. And of course Passover will be important through the Gospel of John and the ministry of Jesus, because Passover will be the time period in which Jesus goes to the cross as well, which will unpack the imagery of that as we get further into the Gospel. But here there's a Passover that is taking place, and so Jesus goes to Jerusalem to observe it. This was important because the sacrifices were only to be done at the temple in Jerusalem. This was a very important point of contention, and understand that the only legitimate sacrifices could be carried out at the temple in Jerusalem. So if you were to sacrifice animals somewhere else, that was idolatry. That was very much an act of sin. And so this is why the Jews hated the Samaritans, because the Samaritans had their own place of worship, and they would carry out sacrifices and worship at a completely different place, Mount Gerizim, rather than going to Jerusalem to do that. And of course, there's a lot of depth to that story and a lot of issues that are going on beyond that. But that's one of the main points, or one of the main issues, is where can you appropriately worship and where can you appropriately carry out sacrifices? Well, as according to the Jewish law, it was understood that only the temple at Jerusalem was a suitable location to do that, and only the priests serving at the temple could carry out those sacrifices. So they are observing the Passover, and Jesus goes to the temple, as there would have been large crowds. It's been reported and considered at different times by historians and scholars that there would have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem at this time, not just those who lived there, but many who were traveling from around the countryside and traveling, as we see Jesus traveling from northern Israel. He's going from Galilee down here, and so there were Jews who were traveling very large distances to get there in order to observe this festival. And another significant aspect of this is that because each family unit and different individuals were going to be sacrificing animals at this time, that you ended up having hundreds of thousands potentially of sheep and different animals being sold and being purchased for the purpose of carrying out these sacrifices. And so there would have been a massive amount of sacrificed animals being done over the process of this festival. So there was a lot going on there. Now, just thinking about what's happening here, as Jesus goes into the temple, he encounters a place where, basically a marketplace that is set up inside the temple grounds. And they were selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons. In other words, they're selling the animals that would be used for sacrifices. Now, oxen, sheep, and pigeons were not the only ones that were used for sacrifices. There are other animals that could be used, but these were the primary ones. And this was giving you a sampling of the different level of sacrifices. So oxen or like calves or something like that, they were the wealthier or more expensive sacrifices, the ones that someone like those in the priesthood would use, or those who had more money, the higher nobility, those that could afford the more expensive sacrifices would use the oxen, the calves, things like that. And of course, you need to have the rams and the sheep that were kind of your standard. And pigeons were for those who were poor. They were for those who couldn't afford much, and so there was a provision for them to be able to sacrifice what they could afford rather than having to go broke or bankrupt just to afford a sacrifice. So there are all levels of sacrifices being represented here, and it is a marketplace that is taking place. Now, you may or may not have ever been to an open marketplace where animals are being bought and sold, but if you were to travel to another country, perhaps where those things are still common, you would realize how much commotion and noise there is, and how smelly it is. You've got all the animals there and the smells that they give off, just everything that is very off-putting there. Potentially you've got just the loud noises of people, bartering and trying to determine what they're going to pay in exchange for, the items and the goods in question. You've got a lot of foot traffic and chaos, and it's just very loud, and it's an overload of your senses, just in all the things that are going on. But not only is there the purchase or the trade of these animals for sacrifices, but you also have money changers that are there. And they were there to exchange people's coin for something that was appropriate. And so we're going to see how Jesus responds to this, but I want us to understand what's happening here and why Jesus is so irate, why he is so passionate for what is happening, and why he is going to act in a way we don't see Jesus reacting much, which is to take a whip, to fashion a whip out of these cords and to drive people out of the temple. So when Jesus goes to the temple, there were different layers of the court. At the very center of the court, or rather the very center of the temple, the whole complex, you have the temple itself, the building where only the high priest would go in, where they would actually go into the Ark of the Covenant, where that was being housed before it was lost, all those different things. So you have the Holy of Holies, you've got the temple there in the center, and then you've got this other court, which was only available to certain people. And then you've got another court that was available to a wider audience. So the outer court was the Gentile court. And that was one where anybody could go in, whether Jews or Gentiles, men and women alike, that they could all go in there and they could kind of mingle around or worship or do whatever was they were there to do. And so in the Gentile court, that was a little more open. Then you had another court that was more restricted, where Gentiles couldn't go in, and you had a court where there was only women were allowed, or where women and men were allowed, but women could go no further, right? And so when you get to the closer courts, you've got basically, with each step you're taking further in towards the temple, fewer and fewer people can access it. So on the outer court, everybody can be in there. Then you've got a court closer in where you've got like only men are allowed, and Jewish men specifically. Then you've got another court where only priests could go, and you've got another area where only the high priest could go. So it gets more restrictive the closer you get to the Holy of Holies. Well, this is being set up in the Gentile court. The outer court here, this is what's taking place. And so what's happening is that Jesus is walking in here, and he's in the outer court, and where people, Gentiles or people who were there maybe to worship, but they were not allowed access further into the temple than what they were in the outer court. They couldn't go any further inside. Well, for those, what's happening is that their place of worship has now been overtaken by these thousands of animals and all of these people that are bartering and selling. And so other Jewish people who would come, who were going to take their sacrifices in, they're all crowded in the Gentile court, and basically there's no room for any quiet peace. The idea of being able to hide somewhere and quiet and to pray and to worship peacefully by yourself was not going to happen, because this large crowd of people buying and selling, and these animals that were being led around and sold and all these different things. So it was just a chaotic environment that completely stripped the temple of its atmosphere of worship in order for these sacrifices to be purchased and for the money to be exchanged. Now, it's a big enough issue just for a place of worship to be overrun in a way like this, where those who are trying to worship have no way of peacefully doing so. But it's even worse than this, because what happened is that only certain animals were available or were appropriate for sacrifice. So an animal had to be basically overviewed by the priest or by those in the priest class, and they had to verify that the animal was appropriate for sacrifice, meaning that you couldn't bring a blemished sacrifice. If you brought a lamb that was crippled or had disease or something, that was not appropriate for sacrifice. It had to be something that was perfect and unblemished, that was in good health. So people were traveling miles and miles and miles. They would undergo journeys of days and days, potentially a week or more, to get to Jerusalem. And the danger of trying to bring your own sacrifice with you, you have no idea what could happen to it on the journey, whether it could die on the way there. And so it became a problem to try to bring all your sacrifices with you for a journey through the harsh, barren wastelands and some of those areas kind of out in the wild. To travel some of those roads and have to endure all of that was difficult enough, but then to bring your animals with you and hope that nothing bad happened on the way, it just became a problem. And so one of the solutions was that they would raise different animals in nearby Bethlehem or in places like that, where they would raise up sheep and they would have cattle and things like that. And then the priesthood class would already have those available, so people could come to Jerusalem without their sacrifices, and they could purchase them when they got there, knowing that these had already been vetted by the priest. They had already been cleared as being acceptable, and you could take out a lot of the hassle. It was a lot easier to go about that. Well, the problem becomes, though, that people, when they arrive there to get a sacrifice, they don't have any other option, right? There's no backup plan for another way to get an animal, because they're going to have to take the ones that are at the temple that the priests have already cleared, and they're going to have to purchase those, and they are going to have no competition. So the situation is that the people buying and selling them could do whatever they wanted. They could jack the prices up far beyond the value they needed, because there's no competition, and because these people were not buying them even just for food, they're buying them for sacrifices. They're buying these so they can have their sins forgiven, right? If they don't have a sacrifice ready and they don't offer one up, then their sins are not forgiven. Right? So this is not just a physical need, this is a spiritual need. This is about your standing before God. And so there's a corrupt opportunity here for those who are buying and selling, that they have no competition. They can jack up the prices to whatever they want. And then, of course, the priests potentially could get a cut of this, because they could make money on the side as a result, because they were the ones who would give the okay for certain people to sell. It wasn't like anyone could just go set up shop and sell animals in the temple. It had to be only ones that were okayed by the priests. So there's a lot of room for corruption here to abuse this system and to line people's pockets. Now you get to the money changers, and why are the money changers there? Well, the money changers are there because no one could just spend whatever money they had to buy things there. The temple would only accept Jewish money. Roman money was not good. The reason why Roman money was not good and acceptable at the temple is because it had the image or the icon of a pagan king on it. So the emperor's face would be imprinted on the money, and that was considered idolatry, that you had a carved image. It was something that broke the Ten Commandments. You had the image of something carved, and so it was considered by the Jewish leaders and people to be an act of idolatry, and there was no way they were going to accept money that had an idolatrous image on it. No less one for the Romans, who they despised anyway. So they wouldn't take that kind of money, so they would have money changers out who would take the foreign exchange rate, and they could make up their own exchange rate, basically, to try to tell people, okay, if you give me this much of your Roman coin, we'll give you some of this acceptable Jewish coin that doesn't have an image on it, it's not idolatrous, and you can pay for it with that. Again, there's room for corruption here, because they can't pay for their sacrifices with any of their own money. They've got to use only acceptable Jewish coin. So you've got all of these Gentiles or people who are coming from other areas of Rome where they don't have Jewish money, so they have no opportunity otherwise. They have to exchange their money, and they are beholden to the rate that the money changers are going to offer. Again, that the priests have given them an okay to be there, and they could be getting a lining of their pockets as well, getting a piece of the pie there. So what's happening is you've got all of these people gathered in here crowding out worshipers, and they are using the opportunity potentially to line their own pockets. And they have corrupted the process because there's no competition for this, there's no other option, and people are basically having to pay whatever is demanded of them in order for them to have their sins forgiven. You can see how this can become such a big problem for those who are already struggling financially, or those who are trying to just to worship, but they're not able to, or they're having to fork over a massive amount of money, potentially an unfair amount of money, in order to carry out something that God has required for worship. And so this can help you understand why Jesus is so angry with what's going on. So because he is angry at how worship is being corrupted and money is being made off of this process to line people's pockets, he is so angry about this that he takes these cords and he fashions a whip. It says that he takes the bags of coins that the money changers had, he pours them out in the temple, he overturns the tables, he throws a whip at people and the animals, and he drives them out, all these different things that happen. And he says this, "Take these things away, do not make my Father's house a house of trade." In other words, he says, my house is a house of prayer. My Father's house is a place for people to worship and to commune with God. It is a place for them to experience God and to have a deeper understanding of him, to grow closer to him, to offer up sacrifices, to make things right, to receive forgiveness from him. And you have turned it into nothing more than a marketplace where you can make your own money and you can line your pockets and become wealthy. You can try to make an exorbitant amount of money for yourself based on the spiritual needs that other people have. And of course, then his disciples remember as well that this passage from Psalm 69, verse 9, "Zeal for your house will consume me," and they understand Jesus is zealous for the house of his Father. He is zealous for what happens here, and he is angry that they have turned something that is meant for worship into a way of being able to gather money and hoard money for themselves. So then the Jews in verse 18, the Jewish leaders that are at the temple, they approach him and they say, "Well, what sign do you show us for doing these things?" Why are they asking this? Well, they're saying, you are demonstrating some kind of authority here, right? You are taking authority over what the priesthood has said. They've told people they can be here and sell these things. They've set these rules in motion. So what sign can you give us to show us that you have the authority to do this? What authority do you have to start casting people out and to make this kind of claim? It's interesting that initially they don't seem to respond in anger. They're not necessarily hateful of him, but they are asking him, you need to give us some sort of evidence that shows you have the authority to do this. The Jewish people were looking for a Messiah, and they believed that the Messiah, when he would come, would change things, that he would establish a new temple, and that he would bring a cleansing to everything around them, and that he would restore Israel to his glory days. So they're not necessarily angry at first. They're about to be. But at this point, they're willing to hear him out and say, okay, if you're doing this kind of thing right now, you're taking this stance, tell us what authority you have. Are you someone that actually can do this, or should we cast you out as a blasphemer right now? So they're asking him about what authority he has. Can he prove it by showing them some kind of sign, some miracle, or something that would vindicate what he is doing? And Jesus gives them an answer. He says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, as John's going to explain, Jesus was talking about what would happen in the future. He's talking about the fact that he would die on the cross, and he would be raised again on the third day. That he would spend that time in the grave, and he would rise up, and he would resurrect, and that was the sign. So what he's saying is, the evidence you need, or the sign that demonstrates that I have the authority to cleanse this temple, and to cast all of you that are corrupting this out, and to bring this back to a place of worship, the authority I have over the temple to do these things is that I am going to be vindicated by resurrecting on the third day, that I am going to die for the sins of the world, and I am going to raise again on the third day. That is the sign which will prove that I have the authority to do these things. Well, of course, the Jews don't understand him. This will continue to be a problem for the rest of John's gospel. They don't understand it. They say, well, it's taken 46 years for us to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days? So they're saying, look, this temple, this is Herod's temple, one that was very expensive, that was a lot of money was spent on it, was very luxurious. They say, it took 46 years to complete building this temple. How in the world are you going to destroy this temple in 3 days and raise it up again? How in the world could that possibly happen? They think he's a madman. They say, this is a ridiculous sign. There's no way you could do something in 3 days that it took 46 years for Herod and all of his men to accomplish. And the problem is they're thinking in a physical sense, not spiritual. Their thoughts are limited to the temple, the rocks and the brick and everything that is around them. They're thinking about the physical temple. Jesus is talking about his body. He's talking about what he will do and dying for sins and raising again to new life. And so this is what John explains in verse 21. He says he was speaking about the temple of his body. And so when he eventually did raise from the dead, his disciples remembered at that time what he had said before, and it encouraged them, and it deepened their belief in the scripture and what Jesus had said. And they remembered, you know what, Jesus talked about this. He said this. We didn't get it at the time, but now we understand what he meant. And it was a way of deepening their faith when the time came. So just an incredible discussion there about this sign. The sign of Jesus' power and authority is the resurrection. But then in verse 23, just to finish out this chapter, it says that when Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover, so during this time, there were many people who believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. So when they heard him teaching, they saw him doing miracles and things like that, things that Jesus doesn't, they're not described. John doesn't describe this for us or all the things that were happening. He's highlighting for us one of the important, visible aspects here, but he's not giving us a rundown of everything Jesus did and said when he was here at the Passover. But during this time, many people believe in his name, and they begin to look to him as the Messiah because of what he is doing and saying. But he gives us another detail. Jesus didn't, on his part, entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. What he's saying here is that Jesus was confident in his identity and his authority, and he didn't need the affirmation of people to be confident in that. In other words, Jesus knew who he was. Jesus knew and was confident in what his mission was. He knew that the Father had sent him. He knew the Father would vindicate him. And all he cared about was doing the Father's will. He didn't need the Jewish authorities to give a thumbs up and say, this guy's legit. He didn't need their testimony about him. He didn't care about it because he knew that's not what's important. Having the testimony of men didn't matter. There were many people who claimed to be Messiah besides Jesus, and they had the thumbs up or the support of Jewish leaders and priests and people like that, and yet they turned out just to be men. So Jesus didn't care about what the Jewish leaders and the people thought about him in terms of whether or not they believed in what he said. He didn't entrust himself to them. He didn't give himself over to them and allow them to have any sort of authority or impact in his ministry. He wasn't serving people or serving their whims and what they desired. He was serving God's desires. And so Jesus didn't entrust himself to them. He didn't allow them to cause him to stray or to direct him in anything. He continued to follow the direction of his Father. In the same way, he didn't allow even his own mother to dictate to him different things. He said, in this regard, the one who is my guide, the one who is leading me in this is my Father in heaven, and no one else is going to lead me away from that. I'm not going to entrust myself to them because their understanding of what I should be doing is not what God's direction is in my life. And so Jesus was very careful that as he desired to reveal himself to people, he was careful not to allow them to redirect his course or to make him into what they wanted him to be. Because his identity he was sure of and confident in himself and in the testimony of his Father in heaven. He wasn't concerned about the testimony of others and what they may think of his reputation. And so that's where we're going to close out for this portion of our study. I want to thank you again for joining me. And we're going to continue on with the story of Jesus and Nicodemus, a very important passage in chapter 3 with some very, very well-known verses and statements that we see from this conversation that unfolds. But again, thank you for joining with me as we continue this study through the Gospel of John.